I think we are good to start. Okay, hello everyone. Good day from Prince George. My name is Siraj Islam. Uh, I will be chairing this session. Uh, it's on extreme event in changing climate, session 3040. Session is sorry on climate, community service, and education. And before we start the presentations, I want to acknowledge that we are on completely in a First Nation land, and I'm very thankful to them for allowing us to work here, live here peacefully, and having this online event right now. Uh, okay, so we have only three presentations today, and the first presentation is by uh, Jeff Strong, and the second one is from Emma Poirier, and then we have Charles Paterson. So the session will end quickly, I assume. We have to make sure that we are on time, if we only have three presentations. So there are 15 minutes for each presentation. Uh, Hopefully, you guys will be finishing it around 10 minutes or leaving some time for the questions. But I will give you a warning on 12 minutes, and then at 15, I will, hopefully you guys will end the presentation by that time. Yeah, I think we can start it, and I would like to invite Jeff Strong, who will be talking about climate crisis, a way forward. Jeff, I will stop sharing my screen, and you need to share your screen.
Oops. Am I on there yet?
Yeah, we can see your slides. Do you want to make it full screen?
I can't see them myself. So you're
we can see you, and we can see your
but
slide.
I need to see my screen.
Okay.
Can you take off the, well, maybe it's on my, it's not replacing your screen, which shows all the participants on here.
We can see your slide.
But I can't see them. That's the problem.
Okay.
No, I can't see it. I'm done. Now I'm just showing myself here. I'm not sure what's going on here. All I see is myself now. Maybe I can move that down. Okay, just a minute. Shall I go from there? Our display settings. Oh, okay, am I okay now? I can go from here. Okay, so thank you, Siraja. I hope I pronounced your name right. And good afternoon, everyone. So this year marks 50 years I've been a member of CMOS. But I also represent KCOR, the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome today, who are in their 50th year of operation. And the photo that I show you here is a pristine view of Cowichan Valley and Cowichan Lake on Vancouver Island, where I now live. However, we also see evidence of damage that humans do to the environment in this picture, with many forestry clear cuts on steep mountain slopes that you see there. These slopes annually receive 2,000 to 4,000 millimeters of precipitation every year. So that on many of these slopes, the soils are washed off in a couple of years, never to sustain. So it comes down to the fact that humans are carrying out unlimited growth in population and all resource extraction, in corporate profits. All of these things have been increasing exponentially, all to satisfy human greed. But it cannot be maintained much longer. Is it necessary, for example, for corporations to always increase their profit every year? What's wrong with a stable profit? One consequence of this is that global carbon emissions have also increased exponentially in the past century. And just we take note of the single downturn in emissions in 2020, which was a result of the infamous COVID pandemic, when industries all over the globe were forced to shut down for anywhere from 1 to 3 months. But that simply proves that we can reduce emissions if we really want to. And it follows that atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are also increasing exponentially. It's a bit smoother than the other chart there, because the atmosphere is a great mixer. But also, not all industries and countries report their emissions faithfully, and you can read that word as truthfully, while nature does not lie in the atmospheric picture. We go to the next slide, and it's simple to note that resulting global temperature anomalies also show a kind of an exponential increase. The annual values here are more variable because surface temperatures have more variables affecting the temperature. And notice that the average trend, I'll put it in here, that broken green line there, is just about linear from about 1965 up to 2015. 2015 being the year of the Paris climate meetings, when the IPCC really started pressuring countries to make rapid reductions in emissions. Many climate experts feel that the rate of warming, I put on this dotted line here, has increased significantly since 2015. But we need another 10 years of data or so to really confirm that. But ultimately, this shows that we're now in a war against climate change and against fossil fuels. And the question arises, what is Canada doing to help fight the climate crisis? What's the plan? Unfortunately, Canada's plan has a focus on continued support for fossil fuels well past 2050, but they still claim they are countering carbon emissions. And that's an absolute contradiction. Reduce carbon emissions and still support fossil fuels? That it makes no sense. In fact, it's nonsense. So I'll just key in on 5 of the processes that are included in the climate plan by which they claim to be countering carbon emissions. I won't try to explain here why none of these will work. That's why I put X's on them. We give detailed reasons for that in a paper that appeared in our CMOS bulletin just last month on the way forward on the climate crisis. Also, we've published that in the Ottawa Hill Times newspaper in a 2-part series there, as those links are available for you to use at any time. However, what I would like to do is demonstrate to you this one on carbon pricing and why it won't work. Last year, in 2022, I think it was, they claimed that carbon pricing was responsible for an 8% drop in carbon emissions. And I've plotted these out myself here from the data, which is readily available on the ECCC site. Their 8% reduction is based entirely on one value, that in that COVID year of 2020. And they should have their fingers wrapped royally for that. You just don't do that with statistics, right? Values increased again in 2021, as I would have expected, and again in 2022. And I'd dearly like to see 2023 values because I'm almost certain this is not real data 2023, but I'm almost certain that it will have increased even further. In other words, their statement of an 8% reduction is deliberately deceitful. A lie, in other words. Someone should have stopped that, but media picked up on that and spread it all over the place. So I expect the data for 2023 hasn't been released for political reasons. Anyway, it's not available yet. And I checked this as recently as yesterday. There was one useful item in the climate plan, and that is the mandate that all new vehicles sold by 2035 must be full electric. And I applaud that, although a conservative government, if it comes in next year, would remove all of these processes. So I'll go on with this slide here. You know by now that the way forward that I promote is through renewable clean electric energy. And these include developing solar farms. For example, this is the solar farm in Alberta, the largest one in Canada. But thanks to the intelligence of Premier Danielle Smith, all renewable energy projects have stopped as she wants Alberta to remain a single industry province. Smith doesn't see the writing on the wall for fossil fuels. Now, there are some who think that solar and wind farms are not very aesthetically pleasing. They may have a point, although they don't bother me. But for those people, I offer them Fort McMurray oil sands if they think that's more aesthetically pleasing. And I'll just go on from there. So I mentioned earlier that we're now in a war against climate change and fossil fuels. However, if we attempted to start an open war with fossil fuels against our renewables, we would lose badly because they have all the money and the power, of course, to do that. However, there is a specific way in which renewable energy should come about, and this is important. Consider first how small armies in history, we mention a war, how small armies in history survived wars against much bigger opponents. And I'm going to use as an example General Hannibal, who defeated the larger Roman army in 215 BC by flanking the enemy. Now here's a picture I admit I took from the internet, the Battle of Cannae in 215 BC. Now remember, there were no guns or cannons in those days. So their soldiers, the Roman soldiers lined up in lines like this here, would have maybe a spear they throw at the opposing army, or have a sword with a shield, or they had these fellows in the background who would have a bag of stones and a sling that they would throw at the enemy, and they could kill an enemy 200 yards away. They became quite accurate with that. But Hannibal, realizing that the Romans here, he's probably observing over here on the other side of the river, realizing they had 86,000 troops against his less than 40,000, he knew he was going to lose this battle if he didn't change tactics. So he immediately got his generals to change from this V formation into a straight line, spread them out, and then he took the ends and brought them around to the rear of the Roman troops. Now there's soldiers getting attacked from the front and rear simultaneously are left bewildered and usually disorganized, which they were. And 80,000 Roman troops were slaughtered on the battlefield that day against only 8,000 Carthaginian troops. So Hannibal's tactic is still studied by military people today, but how do we apply that flanking pincer tactic against fossil fuels? Here they are. And we use small-scale renewable microgrids. Now, a microgrid can be as small as someone putting a bunch of solar panels on the roof. And as long as they have a battery to store the energy, that's a microgrid. So you have one here, maybe one over here, and you might get a little more ambitious, but maybe they're developing a new town somewhere or other, and you make that all renewable energy, maybe a combination of solar and wind, for example, for energy security. Eventually, you have all of these renewable energy little microgrids all over the place. And at that point, fossil fuel realizes that suddenly they've lost access to some of their resources, and small industries have been encouraged to switch to electric energy. That's not a big problem there because managers of small businesses and small industries are bean counters, and they know that electric energy is far more efficient than fossil fuel energy. So the next big maintenance issue they would switch over to electric energy. That draws resources away from fossil fuels. They also join these microgrids up to the major grid and or other microgrids for energy security. Renewable energy must not tackle fossil fuels head on. You leave that to market forces. They take over, fossil fuel demand shrinks, and the supply shrinks, and carbon emissions are ultimately reduced. In other words, you have to think global because you have to know what the global situation is in respect to climate change and with respect to economies, but you act local. Now, if you decide you'll only be concerned about Canada's climate, take a conservative view, in other words, and not other parts of the globe, that's a little bit like the chaps here in the bow of this boat here are saying, sure glad the hole isn't at our end. In other words, we're all in the same boat, and with climate, we're on the same planet. So once again, think global, act local. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. I was just gonna mention that 12 minutes passed, but you finish it. That's good. So, okay, so we have time for some quick questions. Anyone from the audience, if you have any questions, you can write in the chat.
I don't know how I get my screen back here. It's not important, I guess, but I want to hear the other talks. So. Are you hearing me?
Any questions, Jeff?
Have
Yeah,
I
we
lost?
can hear you,
No.
Jeff.
This is all a bit confusing.
Okay, so Jeff, maybe I'm trying to understand that trend you were showing about carbon emission 8% versus 3%. I think the quick drop in that trend is due to COVID, right? Somewhere around 2019,
Exactly.
starting from 2019 all the way to 2021.
Yes.
So like during the COVID, we were seeing like all those carbon emissions were kind of reduced because many people were staying home and industries were not that efficient.
Yeah.
Do you have any comment on that, like how that trend will change if
you saw that
do the
emissions
COVID?
were reduced that year, and Canada's were as well, and the government took that as saying, well, our efforts at reducing emissions are right on, and that's why our emissions reduced. But it wasn't that reason at all. It was all because of COVID.
Okay, so I can now see some questions which are submitted. Maybe I'll just quickly go over them. Can you see them or no? I don't think so. You can see them, right?
No, I'm going to log off and log back in. Are you able to get me back in if I do that? Because I don't know what happened.
We are like we don't have that much time, so maybe
Yeah, okay.
I will just repeat one of them. For example, there is one about what are some enabling factor necessary for microgrids?
Nothing to it. I mean, the solar panels have come down in price. They've dropped by a factor of 10 in the last 10 years, and probably wind profilers as well. And the beauty of a microgrid is that you can add to it at any time without any disruption to the microgrid, make it larger. So That's the other advantage of starting with a microgrid.
Okay, so I think we are running out of time. Thank you, Jeff, for your presentation, and I will now ask the next presenter, Emma Poirier, who's going to talk about bridging the gap between climate science and adaptation practitioner. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Emma, sorry if I'm not pronouncing your last name correctly.
Yeah, no problem. Yes, so my name is Emma Poirier, and I'm currently with the Halifax Regional Municipality, although at the time of submitting this abstract, I was with Climate Atlantic in the role of climate change science and adaptation specialist. So for this presentation, I'll sort of be wearing both hats.
And I'm Stephanie Arnold with Climate Atlantic. Just to briefly let you know, Climate Atlantic is a nonprofit operating in the Atlantic provinces. We have core funding from the federal government and the 4 provincial Atlantic provinces to provide free adaptation support services and climate services to individuals, sectors, government organizations, and so on.
So we know that climate is changing, and the awareness of that has kind of been increasing, over the last few decades. As we're seeing more impacts, there's more and more science, data, and information that's being generated. We have things like the IPCC that continually publishes reports. We have CMIP, the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, that's continually improving climate models with updated iterations. And we have a lot of research as well, both going into these climate models and also using the outputs for, say, maybe like topic-specific research or location-specific research. But really, what we think is important is that we take that information and use it to make better decisions. So that we become more resilient. So both in terms of having more resilient infrastructure, but also in terms of having more resilient communities. So typically, when it comes to climate change, there are sort of like traditional boundaries. And we borrowed this arrow image from Leah Brasky from CBCL, who actually she showed this at last year at CMOS. So in general, there are certain kind of like experts in certain areas. So we can have some people are experts at developing climate models. Some people are experts at doing analysis or assessments, maybe good at doing like risk assessments or hazard mapping. And then you have people who make use of that information, for example, developing policy or implementing programs or implementing adaptation action, and that really have kind of the goal of increasing resilience. So climate services is one way that we can kind of try to bridge that gap between the generation of climate data and information and making use of it for better decisions. Sometimes climate services can be thought of as sort of like the glue between those different groups of people in the traditional boundaries, kind of translating some of that information into how do we use it. So these are some of the like examples of questions that we would get asked as climate service providers. Sometimes that can look like training. So, like what is available in terms of climate data, where do we access it, how do we use it? And that can lead to projects such as implementing coastal regulations, maybe changing industry practices based on how winters will change from more snowy conditions to more rainy conditions. And some of the questions that we would typically get and can kind of expect are some sort of technical questions because people are sort of seeing that climate science being published. So, for example, which future climate scenario or SSP should I use? And when people are asking this, really what they want to understand is kind of the consequence of their decisions. So, for example, are there kind of decision or adaptation choices going to be good enough? Is it going to withstand future climate? So we kind of go through a process of taking the context of a situation into play and the consequences of what if certain things fail. Those are the types of conversation we would have. Things like understanding different types of uncertainty, what uncertainty different variables have, like temperature or rain or wind, and how that changes throughout the time horizon. Really, what adaptation practitioners are trying to get at is, are my adaptation options going to be good enough for future climate? So it's taking those technical information, but making real practical kind of on-the-ground decisions and understanding which adaptation options are available. So for example, this is just a snapshot of a coastal adaptation toolkit that we have on the Climate Atlantic website. That goes through a series of questions that take context and information from climate science, but also gives, say, rural communities options for addressing flooding and erosion. So this is the type of question, I guess, that practitioners really need to answer. Stephanie.
Thanks. And Emma showed this arrow earlier. And other than the fact that there are some fairly firm boundaries, typically, traditionally, in terms of different types of expertise, there's also a strong current flowing from left to right. The amount, like types of data produced really has a big influence on the type of tools and the type of assessments that are available and possible, which then also has a very strong influence in what is used, what kind of conversations we have when we talk to people that have adaptation questions for us. And we also always lead to that one goal of how do we reduce climate risk? What we really need to do is have the users of climate information, as well as the people and the communities that's supposed to benefit from them, have a really full conversation with those who produce these tools, climate service providers who provide services, to figure out, are they asking the right questions? Because is asking about a scenario or a model's uncertainty the right questions to ask at the right time? Maybe the kinds of things they're asking should be, what is the cost of getting this wrong in terms of adaptation? And the options available, as opposed to maybe the data side. And so a lot of it's also guiding and having a back and forth conversation. And so we kind of changed the arrow a little bit. We call it flipping the script. It's really having a two-way flow. So it flows left to right and right to left. And to give you an example, the Federation of Agriculture and PEI wanted to have the producers or farmers have a say in what type of work we're doing. So rather than only have one goal, which we have multiple goals, so I have multiple bullseye there, is how do we reduce climate risk, but in a way that also reduce risks to your business sustainability, to environmental sustainability, to regulatory risks, to the labor constraints that you're facing. So if adaptation can be integrated into all of those things, what does that look like? And so to give you an example of education, it was a two-way education. We learned a lot about what was important to farmers and producers, and they learned a lot more about what adaptation could do and could benefit from the other challenges that they're facing today. And so together we created completely new approaches and really started to soften the boundaries and have a bit of a sort of right to left flow in terms of what is produced, what data is important, what data do we need. So this kind of gets to the point where climate service providers and climate services isn't really just a translation of technical info or of providing plain language versions of what's available. It's really about holding change. And so here it's about aligning different goals and moving towards shared visions and values. And these have to be multiple and not just the shared vision and value of one group, and really be prescriptive top down. And sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes it's not easy. So sometimes it's also mediating. How do we have a difficult conversation where maybe there are ideas and perspectives clash? How do we do it in a generative way? And so some of the on-the-ground work there's different types of communities of practice that are showing up. So a change hour is an example where we have people from the climate change sphere, people supporting treaty rights, people supporting poverty reduction, supporting mental health, different people that are interested in different aspects of resilience, wanting to learn and discuss how does my work also help support your work and vice versa. We're also seeing where there's children or youth, and last year at CMOS was a panel that I was part of on equity. There are now new perspectives, new voices that are taking leadership roles in the space, and that's really, really important for that goal alignment and to also push adaptation forward in a way that isn't really just about distilling and using data. It's really, how do we make sure that the impact we have on the ground is equitable, is impactful, and doesn't simply shift climate risks into other risks. So here's a quote from Mary O'Brien. There are infinite questions that you could ask about the universe, but as only one scientist, you must necessarily choose to ask only certain questions. Asking certain questions means not asking other questions, and this decision has implications for society, for the environment, and for the future. The decision to ask any question, therefore, is necessarily a value-laden social political decision as well as a scientific decision. And that's really important to think about, just because sometimes science is seen as objective and unbiased. But if science supports a status quo and adaptation supports the resilience of the status quo, and we recognize that the status quo is unfair, is unjust, then we are inadvertently propping up a system that is harmful to certain parts of the community, to certain ecosystems. And so if we do actually take seriously the question of value in science, then we might start asking different questions and we start getting different answers.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, I recently joined the Halifax Regional Municipality. So I just wanted to wrap up by kind of showing maybe some examples from the climate plan, Halifax Acting on Climate Together that we have, and sort of like how climate services has helped or can be linked to some of these projects to improve them. So one example is climate hazard mapping. That's kind of a common project maybe across some different areas. And having the support of knowing how to, not only how to include, but how to communicate different projections into those mapping products can be helpful. Another one that comes up a lot is sort of making business cases for new, more resilient projects. So if we want to do upgrades or enhance things to be built to future conditions, having that business case of how things are projected to change using future climate data really increases the opportunity for those resilience projects going forward. And then another really important one is really kind of focusing on making connections and leveraging those connections and sharing experiences and sharing knowledge, and perhaps maybe like increasing the reach of different engagement initiatives so we can have sort of that back and forth or two-way flow. And I think it's really through these collaborations that we can sort of foster sort of more of a maybe a culture of collective resilience. Yeah, so that's all we have. So thank you for listening, and we're open to questions.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie and Emma, for a very interesting presentation. We have one question in the chat for Stephanie. How do you predict or guess at future risk if future carbon emissions are unknown?
To give you an example of that Federation of Agriculture project, there are some risks that we can quantify using projected data. So for example, projected data on heat and temperatures. Let's say we know that certain pests may be really active and might produce, let's say, for example, a 2-degree rise in temperature. We know that from research and modeling that a certain pest in the potato sector can multiply 5 extra generations. And that gives farmers an example of how much more pest management they have to do when we hit that 2-degree increase. Not everything is knowable, but we find that when we really get down to the nitty-gritty of preparing for something, let's say storm surge, right? That's it's fairly difficult to predict, but it isn't really hard to engage on with communities that have some past and lived experience in terms of talking about options. That's why sometimes when we get bogged down into selecting scenarios, we might not be having the really important conversations like what kind of supports do you need when something like this could happen, and kind of getting us there.
Okay, thank you. I'm just waiting for the online questions because it seems like there is some delay, but I don't see anything for now. Okay, I think we are running out of time. So maybe thank you, Stephanie and Emma, again for your presentation. I'll go to the third presenter, Charles Paterson, who's going to talk about a brief history of surface observation in Canada since 1871 and their usages.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I will put myself into presentation mode. Can everybody see? Can everybody see?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. Mine relates in a different way to the past presentations, the two that we've seen here and some of the others, in that I am talking about the observations, the surface-based observations, many surface observations, in fact, going back in history, but up to the present, from which one draws the models and draws the projections forward that we talk about. So without further ado, my background, by the way, was I was the manager of climate archives and also of the Surface Weather Network in ECCC, amongst a lot of different other jobs in the organization over 30 years. Surface-based observations go back further than we think. And what we did with them was different from what we think. We think in terms of, well, if you go to the climate data online or some of the other sites of surface data in Canada, you see these hourlies and dailies. That's actually far more complex than that. As we reading and looking at the data, that in fact there is a system where 60 of the stations were transmitted by telegraph by 1930, between 1870 and 1930, where they increased, and they were plotted on charts. And this was the first kind of real-time data in climate going back to the 1870s. What we have, I try to do is divide up into 3 eras that kind of give a clear idea of what was going on in terms of observation history. First thing, if you go back to Victoria Slonowski's book, wonderful book that she has on the climate observations in the Empire. I've got the link at the end there. And we go back to 1742 with the first instrumental observations, not just observations that were like this, the weather this day was such and such here, but instrumental observations. But all these observations were on paper. They were for various periods of time, sometimes 25, 30 years, but very little continuous observation up until 1871 with the foundation of the, Meteorological Service of Canada in 1871 and the beginnings of expansion of the observation base, at least on the surface. Then we have a long period up until the early 1930s, where the vast number of these observations were done through paper, were kept stored on paper, reports were issued, but of these, key stations were transmitted through telegraph and to forecasters who plotted the data. There was a recent story in the CBC back in December of last year on weather codes, and I have the link here. I invite you to read it because it's quite interesting about how this was found out. So the data becomes available near real time to forecasters. People, the public gets some idea. Things are posted up or flags are set. The Marine, there's a lot of like flags issued to mariners stored in paper forms, and eventually a lot of this wound up in punch cards later on. And it was transmitted to the people, even though the vast majority of stations recorded paper that didn't see the light of day until reports were issued years later. A lot of this data was available somewhat real time. This is an example of an early such station, and it comes from the Military Communications and Electronics Museum in Kingston of an observer who transmitted through telegraph in the 1920s and actually up to the 1950s. The third era is really in the middle, where aviation becomes a dominant reason for observing the weather, and you have more frequent data such as hourly or at synoptic intervals, and different types. Upper air observations become common. The teletype, from which was much easier to transmit than telegraph, becomes in use, providing faster and easier transmission and the receipt of the data. Punch cards begin to be used for queries, and that's how people access. This is in the days before mainframe computers. The data is more available, more real time to forecasters, and dissemination on radio and eventually TV. And quite a bit of this data, unfortunately, is not available or difficult to access. That's the subject of other presentations sometime. Then we get into the era of the mainframe computer. Radar becomes important. Tapes like magnetic tapes, auto stations become part of the the mix of the data. And what's happened at the same time as all these auto stations begin, a lot of the daily climate stations start to close. This data that's available real time can go into numerical weather prediction. And the data was available punch cards, then tapes, then into relational databases, and a lot of still through a lot of forms and publications. Some of this data is not readily available. And finally, the last 30 years up to the present, we have surface and upper air observations transmitted real time. Number of staff sites is slowly diminishing and becoming automated. The Canadian Lightning Detection Network starts up in 1998 and becomes an important factor. Most daily climate observations that are still made are moved to a web transmission. And the presentation of the past weather moves some reports to requested queries. And this is present weather too, and several websites, including the Climate Data Online. And much of this data is not readily available. There's so much data that doesn't really see the light of day or sites that people usually see. This graph gives an idea of the rise and fall of the daily climate stations, with a few of the telegraphic ones in there as well, up until about 1940. This is a mixture of the different types of data. The bottom with blue is the staffed observations, and the ones on top are the different types of auto stations over the period from 1934, where the numbers of hourly stations become significant. I'm relating to the user groups of this data. We have in real time, we have the forecasters with numerical weather prediction and the use by aviation, and all other groups such as the websites we post, weather radio, emergency services. In non-real time, climate modeling, which is a large amount of the what we talk about in this conference here, agriculture, engineering codes, that's a very important part, the legal monthly and seasonal bulletins, and finally climate normals, which I break down a bit because it gives kind of an idea of the data that's coming in and some of the difficulties we have dealing with it. We've done climate normals since 1921 to 1950. We're currently doing the 8th series of them for 1991 to 2020. In the first set, it was entirely manual. The second set, 1931 to 60, it was done mostly manual, but towards the end, we're able to use computers and punch cards to at least sort things out. 1941 to 70 uses the punch cards done for daily stations. 1951 to 80, in a sense, has the most stations with 2245 total stations. And I mentioned 485 with wind because that's the hourly ones for the most part. And the year of the mainframe computer and the technology in this series is enabling the calculation of the increase in numbers. Then in some sense, we go the other way for normals. They become more difficult to do. When we get to the 1990s, we're doing the 1961 to 90 normals. We have changes in the technology. We went from a mainframe database to a relational database, and the numbers of stations were beginning to change in their nature. Also, we did the first normals for the WMO, which is another important use of this data. The normals are done to show what is supposed to be mean for the climate. During the next two sets, the numbers decline, 1,480 and then 1,136 stations. And then with the struggle which we are having, we are still doing the 1991 to 2020 normals, and we're trying to get, well, in this case, hundreds of stations, but hopefully more. And the big problems we have now is, well, okay, the numbers of stations producing climate normals has decreased. Daily climate stations, which many of them have closed, stations have converted, making it very difficult to try to deal with the different types of data. This, of course, comes out the fact that it's hard to do modeling when sometimes you don't know what the metadata is and what is there, and diminishing resources are available for the work. So the conclusion I come to, conclusions, well, the technology for gathering the weather observations and the dissemination have in the past been a main limiting factor to what data is available. So we have daily observations on paper and a few stations transmitted by telegraph. For surface data, we have a lot more data than currently is gathered from the sensors and currently available to the public. Like minutely data logger observations are transmitted, but we can't do much with them at this point. Upper air is very much the same thing. We have a dense network of data on the flights, and very little of it is available. Historical data, the knowledge of the data available, and the resources that we have are currently limits to its availability. In terms of the present data, the ability to find, process, and present the data is the main limiting factor. There is tons more data than is able to be presented by all sets of disseminators. And if we can make this kind of missing data available to users, climate reanalysis can be improved. We talk about a lot about this at CMOS. And then the data can also be disseminated more completely and quickly to all users. I just state my references here. I noted in the Victoria Swanovsky's book here, Climate in the Age of Empire. Several of the histories by Morley Thomas. Some past information, some of it came from CMOS, such as the Jacqueline Blackburn article. And any questions?
Thank you, Pat, for the presentation. Let's wait for some questions. I somehow have some delay when I see on the second screen for my question and answer. Is there any question? You can type it in the chat or in question and answer. Seems none so far. Yeah, so there is one about how do you see development of climate models and forcing scenarios fitting into the two-way arrow you mentioned? Okay, I think that's for the other presenter.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know, like something is happening on the screen or there is a delay there. Anyways, I was just thinking about the satellite information, Pat. Like, do you think that's like we have seen an increase in the density of these stations and then it's decreasing? Do you think the satellite monitoring is playing its role, replacing the need for more stations, or they are adding more information to these stations?
Well, they are very much adding information that we need. Satellite is filling a gap. And much new development in satellite is helping to overcome the decline in the numbers of stations. Now, I say the numbers of stations because the amount of data coming from the stations, even there fewer of them, is far greater than in the past. And that's also showing that explosion of data that we're unable to disseminate very easily. But satellite is a huge contributor to improving the quality of data that we have. Satellite can fill the gaps very much.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? We have some time for discussion. I don't know, like we can keep the session on for a few more minutes. Any question to any presenter before we wrap up? There is one quick question. Maybe I can just go over it, Charles. Are there alternative technologies or data collection methods we can use in lieu of climate station?
I don't see the problem as being the data collection. Now we have good data collection it has improved in many ways compared to the past. We now have so much data from so many places. Our difficulty is getting it to the people. I think the main thing is knowing what's in the past that's not able to be accessed very easily, but also being able to access much of the data which is collected but not really available.
Okay, I think we can wrap this up. So thank you everyone for your presentation. Thank you, Jeff Strong, Emma, Stephanie, and Charles Paterson for your talks. I think we are almost done, and have a good day.